afternoon, everybody. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at an interesting topic called DNA testing. I hope that I'm going to be able to answer a couple of basic questions about the topic, like what exactly is DNA and what does it mean by DNA testing. In terms of language learning, you will firstly identify key terms related to the topic. Second, you will recognize main ideas from a biology lecture. And finally, you will learn how to give a presentation using quotations. So, I'd like you to relate this topic to your real-life experience. First, let's look at this table. I hope that you will be able to take this survey and compare your responses. As you know, we all have our own DNA, also called genome. So what does it mean by DNA? It contains genetic information from parents that determines our appearances or our talents and probably which diseases that we may be at risk of developing. So compare your responses. Maybe you have the similar eye color as your mother, but your hair color might be similar to your father's. And ask yourself these questions. Which of these traits are inherited, meaning that you were born with those traits, and which of these other traits that are learned or acquired as you grew up? Now, when we talk about DNA, you will come across these two key terminology: genetics and also genomics. They have similar meaning, but the scope of it might be a little bit different. So, what is genetics? It is the study of heredity, meaning that when you have something, it is passed from one generation to the other. And genomics is the study of entirety of an organism's genes, meaning we are looking at the interactions of those genes to a person's environment. Now, when we talk about DNA extraction, scientists use this term to explain how they get DNA samples, for example, from hair or your skin or fingernail. And as you can see from a picture on your right, if you really like crime series or movies, you will see that cops, or what we call it, a forensic officer, collecting blood from the crime scene. For what? There are many purposes for this. You are going to find out about this later in the video. You will also come across what we call it DNA profiling. In other words, DNA fingerprintings. Now, this is the thing that they're used to compare DNA samples. Okay, now when we talk about vocabulary, key terminology, firstly, you need to study the notes prior to the lectures. Usually, you will be given notes or lecture notes for you to study. So study the materials first, and then you should list down keywords, and of course remember these three things: definition, also pronunciation, and how they are used in sentences. You need to read a lot, watch a lot of documentaries related to the topic, and take notes on the keywords, and of course, practice, practice, practice. What about note-taking strategies? As I told you many times, you have to pay attention to the introduction. Be aware of the signal phrases like first, next, for example, in addition. As you can see here, there is a structure for lecture. We have introduction, we have main body, and conclusion. So there are two types of introduction that you may hear from a lecturer. Probably they may start with a phrase like, today we are going to learn about blah, blah, blah. Or in other way, they might give or provide learning outcomes or objectives, the ones that I did earlier in this lesson. Now let's have a look at these presentation strategies. At the end of the module assessment, you will we require you to express your ideas and thoughts through a presentation. So as you can see that there is a structure for a presentation. We have introduction, main body, and also conclusion. Now you can strengthen your presentation by incorporating quotations. As you can see here, when you write a quote, you see the quotation marks there. As John Smith said, DNA profiling is also called DNA fingerprinting. When you present, you can say something like this. As John Smith said, quote, DNA profiling is also called DNA fingerprinting, end quote. You can, you can say the quote part. Okay, now we are going to talk more about this in the lesson tomorrow. So what I want you to do is, this is kind of like a presentation task. You will do this probably maybe at the end of the week. What you need to do is you need to find one research area. Probably you can talk more about DNA research. Maybe if you're interested in energy, you can talk about this, medicine or climate science or robotics, if you're interested in engineering. Okay, now let's watch more information about DNA testing.
Hello. Today I'd like us to concentrate on DNA. We'll focus on DNA testing, and specifically on DNA testing of people. Before I explain how it's done, I want to review a bit from the reading. Now, you'll recall that cells comprise every part of our body. Our DNA is in every cell. DNA contains genetic information like eye color, hair color, height, and many other traits passed down from a mother and a father to their child. So, each of us has our own DNA, our own combination of genetic information from our parents. For example, a brother and a sister may end up with the same color of eyes and hair. However, other genetic information received from the parents will be different, which is why they look different. For example, maybe the brother is short, like the mother, and the sister is tall, like the father. Keep in mind that DNA is in every cell in the body, and that all of these cells contain the same genetic information. Now, let's look at how DNA testing is used to identify people. Scientists create a DNA profile, also called a DNA fingerprint. To do this, they need DNA from the person. They take samples from different parts of the body, like hair, blood, skin, fingernails, and body fluids. Next, they extract the DNA from the cells in these samples. Then, they read the DNA with a computer. They use the data to create the DNA fingerprint. Statistically, it's very unlikely that any two people will have identical fingerprints. Now, let's ask, how is DNA testing used? Well, there are many ways. For example, to identify an unknown accident victim, or to find out who the father of a child is. Now, here's an interesting one. In 1999, scientists used DNA testing to prove that the son of the French king, Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, in fact, died in prison. He didn't escape, as some people had believed. DNA testing identified the son's body. People have been arguing about this for more than 2 centuries. Another use of DNA testing is by police to solve crimes. For example, say there's a murder. The police have a suspect they think did it. In the crime lab, scientists use DNA samples from the suspect and DNA samples from the evidence at the crime scene. Then, they design what's called probes. When the probes are put in with the DNA samples from the suspect and the DNA samples from the evidence, the probes show if the 2 sets of samples match. DNA identification is very effective, but not 100% foolproof. For example, suppose the only evidence at the crime scene is blood from the suspect. If there's a match between a sample of the crime scene blood and the suspect's blood, this will help the police. However, a single match from just blood, in this case, isn't very strong evidence. In contrast, let's say the crime lab has 4 samples from the crime scene and 4 samples from the suspect: hair, blood, fingernails, and skin samples. They design 4 probes, 1 for each sample, and they get 4 matches. Bingo! The police can now feel more confident that they have the right suspect. Why? Remember, I said DNA is in every cell in our body, and each cell contains all of our unique genetic information. Now, let's turn to how DNA testing is used in the medical field. Here, let's consider how genetics is being used to diagnose diseases. With diseases, most DNA tests are given for one of 2 reasons. Either to find out if someone has a certain disease, or to see if the person is at risk for developing it. Researchers have found more than 6,000 genetic disorders. A genetic disorder means something isn't normal in the person's genes, a mutation. A change in one gene can cause a disease, and a DNA test can show if someone has a mutation in a gene that puts them at risk for the disease. Notice, I'm not saying that a change in one gene will cause a disease, only that the risk is higher. We're learning more and more every day about genetic diseases. For example, it now appears that the disease Alzheimer's, which damages memory in older people, is linked to our genes. So, we have to ask, what are the pros and cons of DNA testing in medicine? On the positive side, testing might save lives. If a doctor can diagnose a disease in its early stages, the patient can get treated earlier. Or, if a couple wants to have a baby, they can use DNA testing to find out beforehand if any risks for problems or diseases exist. On the negative side, there's the issue of fairness. What happens if DNA testing reveals that we have a genetic disorder that could cause a disease, and that information becomes known? This brings us to some concerns about privacy. A DNA profile contains a lot of personal information. So I'd like you to think about the following questions. 1. Who should own the DNA fingerprint once it's made? 2. Who should have access to it? 3. How should genetic information be used? And 4. Would you want people, especially people you don't know, to have access to your DNA fingerprint? These are some of the ethical questions we face about how to use the scientific knowledge we have. So, please give these questions some thought as you review the lecture. That's all for now.
All right. So, since this kind of topic is a little bit more technical than the other topics that we talked about, I also provided a sample of how notes are taken. And now you know how and when DNA testing is used. Now let's have a look at the questions. So what you need to do is you need to answer these 4 questions, and then we are going to discuss the answers, hopefully tomorrow. Question number 1, what 2 medical uses of DNA testing are mentioned in the lecture? And number 2, what is the relationship between genetic disorders and diseases, the differences probably or similarity? Number 3, what are the pros and cons of DNA testing in medicine? Pros, advantages, cons, disadvantages. And lastly, we talk about ethical questions. What privacy questions does the speaker consider? And tomorrow we're going to look at the answers. We're going to discuss more about the presentation strategies in detail. And I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.